All right, so our first speaker, Karen Gastineau, is a senior hydrogeologist at Broadbent and Associates based in Reno, Nevada. She is a certified environmental manager in the state of Nevada and a professional geologist in the state of California, and serves as the project manager for environmental work at the former Three Kids mine site. So, Karen, please welcome Karen.
Thanks for the introduction, Rachel. So if you work at AML sites in Nevada, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with the Three Kids mine site, as it's one of the larger AML sites with a lot of active work going on right now. And what's really exciting about this project is not so much the proposed plan to clean it up, but rather the process and funding mechanism by which it's happening. So Lakemore Ventures, a company based in Henderson, Nevada, came up with a creative solution where they would serve as the voluntary responsible party for the cleanup in exchange for the opportunity to develop the site in the future. So it's a great example of a private-public partnership. There are a lot of different agencies involved, some of whom I've gotten a chance to catch up with at this conference. So it's been a great opportunity. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to go through some background on the site. I'm going to go through the process and the funding mechanism, and then I'll touch on the federal land transfer process as well as the environmental work that we're doing. All right, so the Three Kids mine site, it's over 1,000 acres. It's located in the Las Vegas Valley. So you can see it's on the east side of the city of Henderson, which is right here. Vegas is down in this area. The photo on the top right there is an oblique view looking to the northwest into the Las Vegas Valley. In that photo there, you can see the view looking down into where the strip is and some snow-capped peaks in the background. So it's got some nice views. So a little site history. It's a former manganese open pit mine that operated from 1917 until 1961. Initially in 1917, it was pretty small scale open pit mining, and the ore was taken off-site for processing. A couple decades later, the US government was involved at the site. They worked with a couple different entities, including the Defense Plant Corporation, the Metals Reserve Company, and then the Manganese Ore Company. And they were the company that was responsible for building the mine site or the mill site in the 40s. So the most active period at the site was in the World War II era, when the value of manganese was higher. So that's when the most activity happened. The US government continued to work on the site in the 50s, this time with a company called Manganese Inc. to beneficiate the federally owned ore throughout the 50s. Then in 1961, operations at the site ceased, and the site has been essentially abandoned ever since, with the exception of being used for the storage of manganese nodules up until 2003. So this photo here is in the 1950s, kind of during the mine's heyday, where you can see the mill site and the kiln actively running. A couple more historical photos just to get a sense of what it looked like. The top left corner up here, that's the B pit, one of the first pits. And then you can see some of the early mill buildings on the site. Below that are a couple photos with the calciner construction in the 50s. And then there's here, one of the thickener tanks, part of the chemical processing that they did. Below that, one of the early tailings ponds in the 40s or 50s. You can see they're just piping the tailings into that pond, which is unlined. And then finally, on the other side here, it's an auction poster from the early 60s when the mine site had shut down and they were trying to sell off everything of any value at the site. So the current land ownership is a mixture of federal and private land, which complicates the picture a little bit. In this map here, the orange is all federal. It's a combination of land managed by the Bureau of Land Management and BOR, Bureau of Reclamation. And then the blue here is the privately held land. So the federal land adds up to about 800 acres. About a third of that is developable property. Some of it's limited for development because of either access agreements for utilities or just steep slopes that make development difficult. The private land is about 300 acres. Most of that is developable with the exception of So two active private parcels right now. They're located, let's see, about right here on Lake Mead Parkway. So one of those is a boat storage and then one is a convenience store. So they're kind of excluded from the project area reclamation plans currently. So what would it look like if you went out there today? There's a lot of hazards at the site. Primarily physical hazards are the most obvious because there's 3 large open pits. The deepest one is over 300 feet deep. And then there are sheer cliffs associated with those pits. Other physical hazards from the mill buildings and debris left on site. There's large volumes of waste rock up to 10 stories high. There are 3 tailings ponds with dark black silty material. Those are up to 45 feet deep. And the tailings themselves add up to 1.6 million cubic yards. So in the waste rock and the tailings, there's elevated metals concentrations, particularly arsenic, lead, and manganese. But then the tailings and the mill site soil area also has petroleum hydrocarbon contamination. So all in all, that adds up to about 9 million cubic yards of material. And I know probably AML people have a better sense of volumes and what that might look like, but it's a huge volume and it's enough to add up to 4 modern sports stadiums. So that's a way to picture it. So there hasn't been any remediation or reclamation at the site over the last 60 or so years that the site has been vacant. There have been numerous proposals, but none were realistic in terms of cost and scope. And in the meantime, there's been encroaching development with Lake Las Vegas to the north and other development in the city of Henderson to the west. And so that has resulted in more people trespassing at the site. It's actually a really popular tourist destination. A lot of the concrete structures have graffiti out there, and it's popular for dirt bikers. So on any given day, you'll see people out there checking it out. But there are a lot of hazards out there. So all that adds up to it being a pretty high priority for the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection. So this map just shows us a couple of the features that I was just talking about. The tailings ponds are those really dark features here. The lighter color are waste rock piles. The 3 major open pits are the AB pit here on the eastern side. That was kind of the first area that they mined here too. Then the Hydro pit was next, and then finally the Hewlin pit down here. The mill site is on the northeast portion of the site. That's where you have these giant concrete flotation tank structures. So that's where some of the best graffiti is and the most active for people just checking out the site. All right, so that's some background on the project. Next, I want to go through some of the major milestones that have happened so far. So first, in 2007, that's when the project really kicked off, and Lakemore Ventures brought together a bunch of different parties to start to negotiate how they could make this cleanup work. So Lakemore brought together the City of Henderson, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Reclamation, and NDEP all together to talk about it. That same year, Lakemore also secured an option agreement for development of the private land. Then in 2009, the City of Henderson annexed the project area, so that created its own redevelopment agency and it became part of the city itself. Throughout that period, the 2007 to 2009 period, a lot of environmental work was done at the site initially, including a phase 1 and a draft sampling and analysis plan. But then the recession hit in 2009 and the environmental work pretty much stopped for a number of years. In the meantime, in the background, they were still working on getting some federal legislation passed, and that did happen in 2014. I'll touch on that in some more detail later. The following year, 2015, there was some state legislature activity. They passed a law that secured the tax increment financing for an additional 15 years from what was typical. So I'll go into that more later as well. So 2016, the work is proceeding pretty slowly due to investor hesitation. Not much happens at the site for the next couple of years until 2020 when things really pick back up. That's when Broadbent was hired to do environmental work at the site. We've been really busy over 2021 and 2022, and we anticipate that the federal lands transfer will actually happen in 2023, and we'll have the remedial design complete. So more on that funding mechanism, the tax increment financing. So the remediation and reclamation of the site is funded by property taxes in the future. So essentially there are currently private investors funding the cleanup, but then Lakemore will get property taxes or a percentage of it from that development area for the next 45 years. So that allows them to recoup those costs for remediation and reclamation. So that the creative funding mechanism is really the precedent-setting aspect of this project. The site is going to get cleaned up without any state funds or federal funds, which is great. Another interesting part of the project is the fact that there's actually federal legislation that speaks to the project. So in 2014, the Three Kids Mine Remediation and Reclamation Act was passed with bipartisan support, and that authorizes the sale of the federal land in the project area to the City of Henderson Redevelopment Agency. So that happens with the assurance that the remediation and reclamation of the site will happen. So this project has been great to work on because it's really been a win-win for everyone. All the agencies involved in the project are excited and want it to move forward. So the state of Nevada allows the site to be cleaned up. That's long been a priority for them. The federal government is able to clean up an old mine liability without additional funding. Lakemore is able to create a development. And then the city of Henderson, in addition to getting part of their land cleaned up, also gains a substantial tax base in the future. So some more on the federal land transfer process. Although there was a federal act that authorized the sale of the land, it still goes through the NEPA process. So the NEPA process includes preparing an environmental assessment, and that's mostly focused on cultural and historic preservation in this case. The land transfer process also includes an appraisal. So a private company comes out, assesses the value of the land, and then that value is compared to the cost of remediation to determine the cost for the transfer of land. So we do anticipate that the cost of remediation is higher than the value of the land itself. So like I mentioned, the cultural and historic aspect of the land transfer is one of the most important parts that we've had to do, and this is a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but our cultural team at Broadbent went out and did a couple of surveys out there. So Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act applies to any kind of federal undertaking. So the BLM is responsible for identifying and considering historic properties. That includes buildings, structures, objects, or really anything that could be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. There are a lot of AML sites across the West, so the BLM and the state, the Nevada SHPO have worked together to kind of put together some policies to figure out the process. When somebody wants to clean up an AML site, how do the historic properties get protected as well? So a site can either be under threshold, in which case it's an undertaking that has no adverse effect on the historic property, or it can be above threshold, and that's the case here for the Three Kids Mine site. And that's because of the federal land conveyance, because it's a historic property, and additionally, the area of potential effects extends beyond the former mine site itself. So here you've got an example of a site with its under threshold, just a removable bat cage, but then the Three Kids Mine site is just a larger in scale site. So the team went out there and did two different surveys. First, they did a Class 3 intensive survey that focused on the area outside of the former mine site in the project area more so, and that was a 30-meter parallel transects that they did to identify cultural resources. They also did a Class 1 reconnaissance survey, and that was more on the former mine site itself, where the structures are, and that focused more on the research that they did and some knowledge of the historical processes at the site. So if any questions about the cultural resources side of things at the Three Kids Mine, definitely reach out to some of our archaeologists here. All right, so switching gears to the environmental side, the Bureau of Industrial Site Cleanup is the lead regulatory agency overseeing the environmental cleanup. They're based in southern Nevada, and they exist primarily to work on the BMI complex, but they're very familiar with the area and the geology. So they're the ones with the statutory authority to oversee the cleanup, and they've requested that we follow the CERCLA process. So even though it's not a Superfund site, we're generally following that CERCLA process where we start with a remedial investigation, a feasibility study. We've got a proposed plan in draft form that's going to go out to the public to get community involvement, and then there'll be a record of decision, and finally a remedial design. A little bit more on the site characterization. We focused on some of the major areas on site, including these tailings ponds, putting in some borings there, doing test pits and borings in the waste rock piles. We looked at the ore yard, which is located here, and we looked at some downwind areas that didn't have active mine activity, but could have been impacted by wind-blown sediment, and we found that there weren't significant impacts there. We looked as well at some drainages and then certain areas of the mill site based on what we knew about the processes. So we looked at the chemical processing area, the area where the kiln was, mill site dumps that had essentially been on-site landfills, and the locations where they stored fuel. So this map shows some of the results from our RI. You're looking south here. So this is Lake Mead Parkway, and then these are the river mountains surrounding the project area, and this is the former mine site. You can see the 3 pits, so there's a little bit of vertical exaggeration there, but each dot is a sample that we collected and have a result for arsenic. So anything in red exceeded our background value for arsenic, which is about 21 milligrams per kilogram. So you can see that was a common occurrence here in the former mine site area, so that's an important thing to think about once I get to the proposed remedy. A little bit more about our background study. So we had 2 major geologic areas that we looked at. One is this area in yellow here. That's the Muddy Creek Formation, which is gypsiferous siltstone and sandstone. Also some alluvium over there. And then this pink area is the River Mountain Volcanics. So that allowed us to establish background levels, but it also showed that both areas would be good areas for borrow material, which is really important to have a local source. So after completing the RI and a feasibility study, we put together a proposed plan for remediation. So the proposed plan includes backfilling those former pits with the tailings and waste rock, placing a mixture of tailings and waste rock in the hydro pit, that deepest pit in the middle of the site, and then covering that with a synthetic cover, and then the remaining waste rock would go in the Hewlin and hydro pits to backfill those pits. So those would be closed as containment structures with controls in perpetuity. We did a leaching analysis to show that groundwater wouldn't be adversely impacted by placing the waste in the pits. And then in addition to dealing with the tailings and the waste rock, we are proposing to put a 10-foot clean cover across the former mine site. And that was because of those elevated arsenic levels in general around the former mine site. And then with that, there would be an environmental covenant on soil below 10 feet. And that's because if a future resident wants to do work in their backyard below 10 feet, there may be contaminated soil, so there would need to be protections in place. So what that 10-foot cover looks like is basically this whole area in red would receive 10 feet of clean cover. The exceptions are the hydro pit in orange, where there's a synthetic cover, so you could have less of the clean cover. And then obviously the other private properties are included in that. But that's where these borrow locations being right next to the site here and here comes into play, because it's really important to have something close by with that magnitude of cover. So in general, the development is planned to work across the site from west going east. So the timeline, as I mentioned, the federal land transfer is anticipated to happen next year. And the first priorities to clean up the site include asbestos mitigation, and then the tailings should be put in the hydro pit first. After that, then they start the phased development across the site, moving waste rock into the pits, placing that 10-foot cover so that hopefully homes can be constructed kind of before the full project is complete. So with this timeline, by July 2028, the last area is starting to have homes built. So in summary, the Three Kids mine site, it's about 1,000 acres. It's private and public land in the Las Vegas Valley. It operated as an open pit manganese mine from 1917 to 1961, but it's abandoned ever since with not any solution that was feasible to clean it up. So there's the open pits that are pretty huge, the tailings, waste rock, large volume of mine waste material, in addition to materials left behind by trespassers on the site. So Lakemore Ventures has come up with this creative solution to clean it up that only uses private funding instead of having to use public money for it. And so then the federal act allows the transfer of the federal land for development. The site will be cleaned up under purview of NDEP. And then Based on our results, we're proposing to put the tailings and waste rock back in the pits, keep the material on site, use local borrow sources so that we're not trucking things very far and making the project feasible. And so if this project is successful, it could serve as a model, as a funding mechanism for other projects of abandoned mine sites that are near cities in the future. So we hope that people will take this idea and use it elsewhere. With that, I'll take any questions.